So, did everyone see that new Superman movie? Well, I definitely did, and I know I'm a few months late, but I thought it was great. I had been looking forward to Superman ever since its reveal back in 2022, I think. And it was one hell of a ride, with a great number of discourse, anticipation, and, from my side, excitement. But on the topic of discourse, this Superman film has truly inspired a very unique type of critical discourse that I find very fascinating, especially considering the absolute chaos that was going on with the DCU after the Snyder Cut of Justice League released, and also leading up to the release of its last film, Aquaman: The Last Kingdom. But in retrospect, this is by far the most different and, may I also say, divisive take I've ever seen of Superman, obviously not counting the absolute absurdity of the later Reeves films. And that contrast in quality has driven my fascination with the critical discourse surrounding the film. But the main reason I wanted to make an essay on Superman is that, although I don't really pander to any radical critical discourse present in the online world of any film, I do think that addressing the discourse centered around Superman is useful as an exercise in understanding narrative writing, especially in the realm of comic book adaptations and films in general. In fact, I think it's more fitting when it comes to a character like Superman, who embodies the epitome of a strong superheroic figure who has to navigate the world of the modern and contemporary day. So, let's have a look.
Hey! Quit messing around!
I'm not messing around, I'm doing important stuff.
So, off the back, I should start off by saying that I've never really been the biggest fan of Superman as a character. Not because I think he's bad in any way, quite the opposite. On the surface, he has a very captivating appeal to the average moviegoer and comic book reader, and he has always had such a demanding presence on screen. Another reason is his origin story. And I guess I can summarize my fascination with his conception as a character with that one scene from Kill Bill.
Superman was born Superman. His alter ego is Clark Kent. Clark Kent is Superman's critique on the whole human race.
However, the main reason I never really felt intrigued by him is because of his rather two-dimensional characterization and powers. He's the perfect stud. He's invulnerable, he has his physique, the charm, the motto, and the absolute powers of a god. A perfect character. Well, a perfect character is hard to write for, and that is how I would describe Superman, or at least the way he's been portrayed since Richard Donner graced us with Reeves' version back in 1976. And even when he isn't perfect, he was never really relatable, at least not to me. The biggest burden that comic book superhero films have to carry, which Superman definitely does, and this is something that affects even Marvel to this day, is that there's no one version of a superhero character and each person will gravitate to one version over the other. You have more classical and heroical takes on the character, modern and contemporary takes, and more radical and alien takes of the characters that fit nicely in the Elseworld concept. And it's now more relevant than ever with the heavy fixation on the concept of the multiverse. But for this video, I'm just gonna stick with Superman and how he compares to his preceding portrayals, and what the new one changed about the source material and why it did this, more importantly. Superman does pander to that burden, and I would argue it does it pretty well. So, what's the first critique?
If not today, then tomorrow!
The first criticism I will address, and albeit the criticism I agree with, is the problem of pathos comedy, or as I like to call it, the Marvel comedy problem.
Mantis! Look out!
After a great run with the Guardians of the Galaxy films, James Gunn, who was the big man behind the script and the director of the film, certainly brought a lot of his own style and writing that he inherited from the MCU, and you can notice that in the way he writes comedic bits between his characters. He often overlays a ton of comedic subtext over conversations. He has interruptions and escalations rise the momentum of the verbal conflict, but more noticeably, he just can't help himself from using comedy as a way to interrupt whatever is being handled on screen, regardless of the narrative tension or stakes. Like when Lois and Clark argue about his weird insecurity about the super shit hashtag, when they should be focusing on him and his agenda. Another example is Guy Gardner's incessant need to talk about his bowl cut or his need to brag about being part of the Green Lantern Corps. Or more fatally, every time someone has to quip something out after every scene builds in tension. This is professionally known as pathos comedy. He did this a lot in his Guardians films, and it's certainly prevalent in this one. Now, bathos is not inherently harmful. It's a great way to energize dialogue and it has its uses when trying to get a quick laugh out of the audience. But Gunn insists on using it for every moment that calls for narrative tension. It's also the reason why he incorporates a lot of characters in his conflicts to induce this form of comedy. Now, as I will discuss later, this film does do a very good job in balancing the amount of characters it introduces, and each character, regardless of their behavior, has a purpose in the story that aids to the writing. But to name a few examples of bathos comedy which drags down the film, bits with Krypto in the pocket dimension, Mr. Terrific's tone killer of a line after Superman defeats Ultraman, and the one that really ticks me off, Krypto jumping at Lex during his and Clark's exchange in ideology. This is very harmful to a story about Superman. Now, the reason Gunn does this is, yes, to get a quick laugh out of the audience, but I also think it's because he has a certain narrative anxiety about how to regulate the tone of two corresponding scenes. Like he has to use comedy for one scene to flow smoothly into the other one. Now, comedy can be useful to help resolve discussions into action and following events, but it shouldn't be this aggressive. And it's not just Superman that has this detriment. It's even more prevalent in a show such as Peacemaker, which is also a James Gunn project. Now, Peacemaker is a good show in my opinion,
Except when it's not.
but the reason I consider bathos to be more fitting in Peacemaker is because, one, unlike Superman, I don't expect Peacemaker to be held in any high value as a symbol of hope or justice. He's an immature man baby with deep-seated family issues, so of course his sense of humor would reflect that. And second, it's because Peacemaker is a very hard and heavy-handed show with its explicit subject matter, whether that be family trauma, intense gore, or excessive profanity, and Gunn uses bathos comedy to help offset a lot of the heavy-handed material and subject matter on screen, to sort of balance the viewing experience and tone. But with Superman, I want something more. I want to have investment with the conflicts on screen without any interruption. Now, Superman does warrant fun aspects in the comedy, but it needs to be well balanced, especially when your portrayal is centered around the old-fashioned Red Trunks Boy Scout of the character, which, hey, let's talk about that.
You trust everyone.
Maybe that's the real punk rock.
The one thing I really admire about Superman in this film is that he feels truly like he comes from his old-fashioned roots. He has the bright colors reminiscent of the classic Richard Donner suit, he has his considerate mannerisms in battle and when he is Clark Kent, and the entire film feels very lively and comic book-esque. From the superbots to the weird transporter devices to finally a return of the Fortress of Solitude and the weird and wacky characters that feel like they just jumped from the comics. Metamorpho especially sticks out in this department. And the score, oh man, the score! This might be my favorite score of the franchise. It's not the best, mind you, but it is my favorite. And look, I can understand if you point out that there's nothing really special about it, because it's not entirely original, but I am of the opinion that a score doesn't need to be original to be great, and neither does borrowing from another musical motif make it unoriginal. Because despite the heavy influence from Williams' original soundtrack, there are a lot of moments in the score that feel uniquely fresh. My favorite track is obviously the one that plays during Superman's final fight with the Raptors. Just this intense and bombastic rendition of Williams' score. But there is one segment of the music at the beginning of the film when Superman is cared for by his bots that is so beautiful. It kind of reminds me of this one segment in Prince of Egypt. Okay, editor side note here. Obviously, I can't play the tracks because of copyright reasons. Sure, well, that's fine. But I'll link the tracks in the description below and with some minor descriptions about what I mean. And if I'm comparing something to the music of Prince of Egypt, then you know this is something special. Overall, there is a unique sense of comfort I find in the mundane world of Superman that I really appreciate in these homecoming type of superhero films. Superman 2025 does feel more like a Spider-Man Homecoming than a traditional Iron Man story. But I guess that leads on to the next critique that audiences have, which I have rather mixed feelings about, which is...
Help! I made giant oven mitts!
Good for you, asshole!
So these two critiques basically go hand in hand, but as I pointed out in my comedy section, Gunn really clicks well with stories that have ensemble casts. His Guardians films are fitted to him and his style of storytelling. Now, I'll admit that when it comes to a character like Superman, You need him to be a strong central protagonist that has his own sense of story and narrative choices. It's the one aspect of Man of Steel that I will consider to be done better than Superman. Regardless of the narrative direction they went with Kal in Man of Steel, you cannot argue that Man of Steel doesn't feel more character focused on Superman than his successor. Man of Steel definitely has a lot less fat you can trim off than Superman 2025, where there are so many residual elements of the story that have to be there because of separate characters and their plot lines. But what I feel people misunderstand about Superman is that although it can feel overstuffed, each character in the film does have a purpose to serve, even if that purpose is completely stupid, which is definitely the case with the Jimmy Olsen and Eve Techmaster plotline. Putting aside the absolutely comical nature of their relationship on screen, this is a very inappropriate way to develop the back-burning narrative of the story that inevitably leads to Lex's downfall. Lex, after being set up as this absolute criminal mastermind of a villain with power and wealth at his disposal, who found a way to best one of the most powerful beings in the universe, is brought down by his lame, overly clingy ex-girlfriend when she leaks semi-provocative pictures containing valuable info on Lex to her crush at the Daily Planet. This is, kinda dumb. I like how Lex's downfall happens because of the exploits of the Daily Planet and Lois's journalistic abilities, but again, the way we got here is what truly confounds me. Like, couldn't Gunn find another way to do this? Okay, that's enough complaining, because despite the very confounding choices of plot this film makes in the background, it does do something very interesting with the side characters on the side of Superman's story that I find very exceptional. As I stated in my introduction, Superman has no one correct way of being portrayed, and we certainly have had some interesting directions he has been taken in as the red-caped son of Krypton. Man of Steel showed us how the world sees him through the lens of a god complex. Richard Donner's Superman shows us how a being with godlike powers learns to be human and navigate the mundane aspects of the human world, and some more radical versions throughout the years that cater to both sides of his character. What this film does with Superman is very interesting because his arc is impactful to other characters around him. In the realm of screenwriting, there's a certain spectrum of archetypes that writers can fluctuate between when writing characters and their arcs. You have the positive character arc, the negative character arc, and the most interesting of them all, the flat arc. Now, to cover them quickly, the positive character arc is pretty straightforward. A character in the story believes a certain lie about the world or themselves, and their arc is about coming to learn a certain truth that makes them better as a character. Examples of this can be Joy from Inside Out, Neo from The Matrix, and Phil Connors from Groundhog Day. The negative archetype is less common, but it's still simple. The character starts out believing in something good, only to embrace a foul nature. Examples range from Anakin Skywalker in the prequel trilogy, Magneto in X-Men The First Class, and Titan in Megamind. This character archetype is more fitting for villainous characters. However, the archetype I want to focus on with Superman is the flat arc. With this arc, the character starts out believing in a certain truth, and they end up the film believing in that very same truth. Their perspective of the truth may change as they develop through the story, but their opinions of it stays the same. These are often equated to mentor characters such as Ben Kenobi from A New Hope and Morpheus from The Matrix. But there are also protagonist characters that have this arc, such as Katniss Everdeen from The Hunger Games, Paddington from his films, and Marty McFly from Back to the Future. These characters are often referred to as impact characters, because their role in the stories are all about how their belief of the truth impacts the characters around them. Superman starts the film out believing in a certain truth, that you should always be kind and do good unto others who need help, and every character in the story who interacts with Superman becomes impacted by Superman's actions, courtesy of that truth. Whether that be the members of the Justice Gang, the people of Metropolis, and Metamorpho. Now, the Justice Gang is probably the biggest example people point out to when referring to Gunn's overuse of side characters to satiate his Guardian's narrative anxiety, and they do reflect that. These characters are immature, highly cocky mascots in tight uniforms who play around with their powers and crack jokes at every opportunity. But their purpose in the story is fitting given the characterization. Let's consider the first action scene with Superman when they're fighting the kaiju. This scene serves two purposes. The first one is to show just how much Superman values life, whether that be the life of a small squirrel or a giant kaiju lizard. And Superman has to navigate the complexities of the situation to minimize collateral damage because of the truth he believes in, that every life is sacred. Secondly, it's to show just how reckless the methods used by the Justice Gang are when dealing with the kaiju. And their actions cause a lot of harm to those around them, and they end up euthanizing the kaiju just to save face. And as the story progresses, they have to contemplate this idea of how to correctly handle the conflict. And they do so when they see the impact that Superman's good deeds had on the world when Guy and Hawkgirl go out to defend the people of Jarhanpur. The same goes for Metamorpho. From his introduction, Metamorpho is characterized to be very anxious and afraid to act in service of others, albeit for a good reason. But as he observes Superman's actions and how much it affected those he protected, Metamorpho feels the need to do the same as he helps out the Justice Gang fight the army of Boravia. It's a very brilliant way to portray the external impact of a character and a great way to reframe Superman as the role model of the film, that not only the characters can take away from, but the audience as well.
Why are you still gross looking?
I don't know.
So I've seen a lot of people share the sentiment that Superman is not nearly as powerful as he should be. And while it is true that he definitely packs less of a punch compared to his predecessor, which is truly the understatement of the year by the way, I wouldn't say it's because of the power he lacks. In the lore of the film, Superman still has every strength and every weakness as his predecessor. He has his invulnerability, his heat vision, and his strength, and is weakened by kryptonite. I wouldn't say he's overnerfed, rather that his opponents are given more power and there are more rules at play in the action of the film that makes Superman feel weaker when he really isn't. Ultraman is a Kryptonian, thereby being more harmful to Superman. The Engineer has advanced weaponry that can work around his powers, and the way kryptonite affects him is very slightly modified, where he can be harmed by any lesser powerful beings when he is exposed to it for too long. And as I said before, there's more focused on the caution of collateral damage which Superman has to navigate in the action, which definitely strains his ability to perform in the field. Whether that be the big kaiju stumbling around in the city, raining destruction, or being handicapped for the majority of the battle when he is weakened by kryptonite. So while it may seem that he is weaker, that weakness has nothing to do with the power he possesses. Now, why does this matter? Well, the first reason is stakes. By making the playing field more competitive for Superman, there are greater stakes involved. Superman not only has to focus on his opponents in front of him, but also has to ensure the safety of the people around him. And with more stakes at play comes greater unpredictability. No fight in this film is the same as the other, and thereby no one can come to the same conclusion as to how the fight will end, in comparison to the others. And that's what I find so exciting about the action. But the more important reason to change the rules of the conflict is to put Superman in situations where he simply can't punch his way out, no matter how strong or powerful he is. An example that comes to mind is the infamous scene where the Engineer fills his lungs with nanites to choke him from his oxygen supply. Because he can't use force to free himself, he has to utilize more clever methods to free himself from the Engineer's grasp. It's a great way to introduce more dire stakes to the action because the viewer doesn't rely on brute strength as the solution. And the solution he does come up with feels very fitting and smart. The entire city is being torn apart but through a dimensional rift? Well, the only way he can fix it is by getting Mr. Terrific to resolve it at Lukrembo. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a crisis is happening at the Boravian border of Jarhanpur and has to commission the Justice Gang to help him. What I'm trying to get at here are plot variables. Every action scene has different rules and variables that the characters have to navigate in order to achieve victory over the other. And Superman does that very well. There's not really any fight where brute strength is the only solution to the conflict. And I don't want to harp too much on this fight too because to each his own, but this is generally the reason I don't find the final battle between General Zod and Superman very engaging in Man of Steel. Putting aside the immense destruction on display that completely overpowers the visual language of their conflict, I don't think this fight has anything good going for it if the only variable at play here is their strength. Like, hey, let's put both of these powerful godlike beings who are very clearly evenly matched against each other, where the winner is the one that punches the hardest. And this writing philosophy of just relying on power to settle disputes creates a very one-dimensional action scene. Now, you could argue that willpower is also a defining factor here, since Zod is willing to do the one thing that Superman actively dreads, but that on its own creates an even bigger problem that paints Superman in a very unpleasant picture. I'm of course talking about the scene where Superman snaps Zod's neck to end the fight. Now, on the surface, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong about this scene. Comic book stories focused on the idea of superheroes needing to take a life in order to save another is a normal thing to explore in writing. And I do wish comic book stories did this more as a way to explore character. But the reason this is a problem for Man of Steel is because it's the only solution Superman has in order to end the fight. There is no other rule or variable Superman can navigate in order to stop Zod. And even if there was beforehand, that variable still leads to death. And I feel like this entire scene ends this way because the film did not construct any other way for Superman to defeat Zod. Now look, I'm not saying that Superman shouldn't or doesn't use brute force to succeed in the action, because he does resort to it in the newer film. But if strength is the answer to win the fight, it should at least be earned. And it is here that we get to why Lex is so well written as a villain. Lex knows for a fact that he has no power of his own to defeat Superman, and therefore has to utilize other means to defeat him. So what does he do? Here's a question: what's the one thing Lex has that Superman doesn't? And you can probably guess what that is.
Brain beats brawn!
Lex concocts an entire system whereby he's able to translate intellect into power by programming Ultraman, a clone of Superman, with a set of moves that he developed after years of studying Superman, and to then input it into the context of the battle. Something that has the strength and lethality of Superman, but the mind of Lex Luthor. As long as a link between Lex and Ultraman exists, Superman cannot win. But what if Superman can sever that link? Well, that is where Krypto comes in what is probably the hypest moment of the film. Krypto, after being neglected for so long throughout the film, is finally recognized for his worth by Superman and is able to sever that link by doubling down on his obsession with flying gadgets. A great comedic moment that actually works in the film. And let me tell you, once he goes to town on those cameras, oh boy. Ultraman does not stand a chance. Having this entire battle centered around two masters and their servants makes a very engaging conflict, and I like how it loosely ties into one of the themes of the film of one servant being equated to loyalty while the other one being equated to programming. What I love so much about this scene is that the victory feels earned, and both characters feel like they have a good fight, but ultimately Superman wins. So what I'm getting into now is probably what audiences consider to be the most radical change and the biggest critique that defines this film. Superman's parents are tyrannical conquerors and unjust. After 8 decades of storytelling and almost 5 decades of cinematic portrayal, Superman has always developed one singular idea of what he stood for. But above all else, he stood for hope. And every adaptation, at least the ones I've seen, has doubled down on this idea when it came to his heritage. Chris Reeves' Superman had parents who idealized his purpose on Earth as a bringer of peace and power. Jor-El in Man of Steel spells out his wish for his son and his dream of him becoming a savior to humanity. He highlights the great power he will inhabit and his need to do good with it. But above all else, his parents believed in the ideology of goodwill and hope. This was what Superman's heritage always proposed for his character. So to make a change so radical and unfaithful to the central core of Superman's character is certainly one that shocked a lot of people, and by far the biggest deviation from Superman lore. And I love it. I love how this change just hits you with an immense realization of bitter intent upon the character and how it paints Superman in a completely alien manner as compared to his predecessors. It's one I wish more comic book stories explored, but I feel like a lot of people rightfully hate this choice. but for the wrong reasons. And I think it's worth trying to unravel that issue. In order to come to a full understanding, we have to ask, why? Why make a writing choice this radical, and what purpose does it serve in the story of Superman? The purpose of this plot point is to make Superman question his own sense of morality. Superman, who spent almost his entire life believing in a singular truth, that you should always be kind in a world where everyone is against you, and great strength and power should be used for good. It was an ideology he inherited from his adoptive parents Martha and John Kent. But it wasn't until he was 18, supposedly, when he discovered the message of his parents that crystallized this idea, in his own mind at least. From the first scene of Superman in the Fortress of Solitude, where he is cared for by his servant bots, we see just how much the message of his parents means to him, and how much he believes in it. He also later confirms this in his interview with Lois, his state of mind about this message and his parents. And every good act he does because of this message.
What do you know about these biological parents of yours?
Just that they sent me here to serve humanity. They sent a message along with me. That message is why I do what I do.
So, when the truth gets revealed and we know the true intent his parents had for him, Superman has no choice but to confront his own sense of morality. Was he doing everything in the service of tyrannical ideology? Obviously not, but was he doing everything out of good intent if the basis of that intent was built on a corrupt principle? Well, that is what is brilliant. As the film progresses, Superman has to grapple with this dilemma and figure it out for himself and what he stands for. Does he stand for truth and justice according to what his birth parents believed? Or does he believe in truth and justice that he inherited from his adoptive family? Now, looking upon this entire plot development, it really reminded me a lot of another character who had this type of character struggle. Megamind.
Ciao, ciao, all.
Same time next week?
Megamind and Superman have a lot in common. Now, I know what you're thinking. Devin, yes, that's my name, hi. How can they be similar? Megamind is a blue-headed evil genius who relies on gadgets and inventions as his source of power, and he has no sense of morality, whereas Superman stands for truth and justice. Plus, how can you compare him to Superman when his arch-nemesis Metroman, who shares every strand of Superman's powers, is right there? Are you crazy? Well, maybe I am crazy. But the likeness I'm talking about has nothing to do with external qualities. Megamind and Superman are products of their environment and nurturing. Superman was raised by two poor Kansas farmers who knew nothing more than to be kind and caring. Meanwhile, Megamind grew up in prison, where the ideology of crime prevails, and they become servants of these inherited ideas. But the similarity I find more fascinating between the two is that their hereditary backgrounds are shrouded under a layer of ambiguity. Consider the message of Kal's parents, a half-broken transmission where they speak in very vague terms about his purpose on Earth, and this scene in Megamind.
You are destined for...
I didn't quite hear that last part, but it sounded important.
The fact that there is no textual answer means that they have to decide on the truth of their characters for themselves. It's a constant guessing game that invites a lot of imaginative thinking. What would have happened if they did grow up with the truth of their heritage? Would Megamind grow up to be caring and kind if he were raised by the Kents? And would Superman turn out the way he did if he grew up in a more unforgiving circumstance? Of course, the only difference I will point out is that unlike Megamind, Superman does get a textual answer of what his parents wanted for him. And that is where Pa Kent comes in the emotional climax of the film. John outlines that no one is ever sure about their purpose on Earth, and a parent's job is not to decide the path of their child the way Kal's parents did for him, but to simply be there for them as a source of guidance, to give them the tools they need to decide things for themselves, to help, provide, and above all, to be the father that Superman needed, and that with the right wisdom in mind, Superman can carve out a truth that he wants for himself and nothing that is promised to him by anyone else. And this is beautiful. And what does Superman arrive at? He arrives at the conclusion that not only are there people in the world who are good, but that there will always be people in the world who want there to be good in the world. And Superman accepts that. This is what gives him the push that he needed as he races off to stop Luthor. And I like how this ideology of serving accordingly to one's own moral philosophy versus blind loyalty to man's own greed for power is contrasted with Lex and his puppet fighter Ultraman. Superman is no puppet to a higher power of evil. He is a simple man from Kansas trying to do the right thing. And that is what makes their final confrontation in the tower so climactic, as both their ideologies are pitted against each other, and it's all so great. Upon final thoughts, Superman, while it does have its problems, is nevertheless the right step for the DCU, and I am nevertheless so excited to see where it goes next. Thanks for watching.